All right, let's get right into this. This video is essentially about what do we think could potentially happen to disabled people, those who have limitations, impairments in a warlike situation. And the reason I'm doing this video is because I had this comment today, or a question really. I was on the phone from a person who wanted to know what he was going to do if this whole situation got out of control. Now, obviously, since then, Donald Trump, various world leaders have gotten together and agreed to have a ceasefire, ending of a war, etc. And that's a very, very good thing. But many of you also are of the belief that the Iran Israel war is really not going anywhere. In fact, this whole coming together for the Kumbaya moment is just giving time to China and Russia to kind of figure out what their plan is in order to bolster Iran going forward. And that's kind of where a lot of people are at, especially in the Jewish community that I come from. That's kind of where they're at with things. So the person asked me, is like, man, considering all of my impairments, like, how do you think I would survive in this situation? How do you think I would do with this type of warlike scenario going on? And I was like, man, that's a huge question. A, I have no idea. B, like, there's way too many things to think about. But I was like, the first thing you do is you take your top 5 impairments, you'd figure out what the weaknesses are, what the strengths are, and you'd build off of that. So I actually thought about that for a while throughout the day. It just kept popping up in my head. And what I realized was that, okay, this is actually not a bad question for people to be asking themselves. And here's why. There are some major categories. I pulled it up from ChatGPT as to what it thought. And I think it missed some things that I want to add, because if you don't have this, you're not thinking about the whole picture here. When I asked ChatGPT, hey, nuclear war would be the harshest for this Social Security recipient. It came up with number 1, people with mobility issues, wheelchairs, walkers, stuff like that. Number 2, people with respiratory conditions or ventilator dependence, things like that. Number 3, people with cognitive or intellectual disabilities. Number 4, people with visual or hearing impairments. Number 5, people dependent on medication or medical equipment. And, then we get into what type of establishment are they in? Are they living by themselves? Are they in an institution? Are they in jail? Are they in prison? Like, where are they? And what I kind of realized while I was thinking about this whole situation was, okay, considering these different groups of people all have limitations that make it tougher for them to succeed in a war scenario, which one do I feel is going to have the most difficult time? And then how can they prepare for this? So I thought about it and I went back and forth and back and forth. And I think the first thing that most people think about is basically requires medical equipment, right? You're in a rollator, a walker, a wheelchair, you got crutches, canes, you're hooked up to a ventilator, you're hooked up to this machine, you got a blood bag with you. I think that's the first thing most people think about. And that's kind of where my mind went. But I now know that that's wrong. That is not correct. The people that are going to have the most difficult time with the war scenario are the people with mental impairments, specifically PTSD, anxiety, multiple personality disorder, depression. The people who have panic attacks are basically the ones that are most likely to go through this situation and cause some victim mentality, consistent failures. What do I mean? All right, when you have, for example, a parade, or you have, for example, helicopters flying over, or you have, for example, sirens going down the city street, a lot of you are okay with that. It's whatever, it's no biggie. But some of you are not able to mentally get past what's going on around you. The moment that tension of something potentially bad happening around you, your brain goes into this, fight, flight, protective zone, can't move, what am I going to do zone. So to me, yeah, I guess mobility impairments, sure, that's up there, but it's not number 1. We have a significant amount of Americans who, either, mental impairment was congenital, they got it from birth, or it developed over time from potential abuse, or it's just something where, there was a trauma to the brain or something happened and something just in their head and boom. Now they've got really, really bad anxiety or really, really bad depression, things like that. I have noticed, talking with people, that when the Democrats are in, we tend to see people being more willing to talk about mental impairments. Also, I've noticed when Democrats are in, we tend to see a lot more mental impairments coming to light because the economy is usually a total shit show. And people not having money, people not having the ability to have a job that's consistent, that they feel like they're going to be employed at for a long time, all those classic capitalism, oriented things that you normally attribute to Republicans. When you don't have those that create purpose, you see a lot of anxiety and depression pop up. And the thing is, everybody has different varying levels of respect for those people. Some people just like, screw them. Who cares? Whatever. I don't. And then some people really care about them. They're like, oh man, how do we help them? How do we go out of our way to assist them? I think the reality with this situation that most people don't acknowledge, and I think it's an important thing right up front that we need to hit, is that people deal with tough situations differently. Some get really excited right in the beginning and then they calm down. Some they get horrifically just mentally like disturbed the more time goes on. And so one of the things that I think, if we were in a war scenario, that would tell us very quickly if you were likely to succeed in your survival, would be how well you can handle things like, panic attacks, anxiety, the sound of speeding bullets, the sounds of explosions, the sounds of heavy equipment moving down the street, the sounds of basically, people going through very stressful times, if you know what I mean. So I think that realistically, we would see a lot of those individuals having a very difficult time. And I don't just mean in the sense like they would freeze, you know what I mean? Like they would be frozen. I mean, in the sense that like they wouldn't be able to go ahead and move from point A to point B because they've purposely kept themselves in the moment, because in that moment, they are protecting their existence. Let me give you an example. You know how some people, like, they always seem to choose the wrong choice? They always seem to create a scenario where they lose, even though in their head they're trying to protect themselves to go ahead and make the right choice, even though they just keep seeming to make the wrong choice. We have certain medical terminology for this, but it's basically people who make choices intending for good things, but they don't realize the outcome. Intent is good. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not. But, usually the intent is good, but they make the wrong choice consistently. They just fall off the bandwagon consistently. So I think when this happens, to be fair, I think a lot of those individuals are going to become very stuck in the moment of where they're at. They're not going to want to get out. They're not going to want to move. They're not going to want to do things. Now, some of you will say, with PTSD, that, you're stuck, you can't do things. Although, I know with some of these veterans that have PTSD, they start moving before the thing happens. They start reacting before the thing happens. So, it goes both ways with that situation. But I guess I'm just wondering from you guys, what do you think out of all the people that are potentially disabled on Social Security disability insurance benefits or Supplemental Security income benefits, which group do you think would have the hardest time? And the point of this is, I think a lot of people would say, okay, if you're hooked up to a machine that like keeps you alive, right? It's got to have power. It's got to have this. It's got to have a backup of that. Yeah, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. But that is not as widespread of an answer as the amount of people with anxiety and depression. Also, to be fair, when it comes to these machines that keep you alive, as many of you have probably noticed, a lot of them are significantly more mobile than they used to be. The whole iron lung mentality of like, it's there, this is your only thing, you have to plug it into the wall, there's no backup power, this is it. The reality of this entire situation is that a lot of this gear that is used to keep people alive now is inherently mobile. There's a battery backup system, all that stuff. Every so many months, every so many years, they have to replace the battery, do a health check on the equipment, etc. So I don't think necessarily that group would definitively be the group that would be the most in trouble in a nuclear war. I mean, granted, if it was, somebody in the hospital who was in a horrible car accident, there were a bunch of machines on them, keeping them alive. Yeah. Hospital has a bad day situation. Yeah, sure. They're going to have a tough situation. But to be fair, they really could not take it into their own hands, if you will, to go ahead and fix the situation if they wanted to. They're bedbound, right? They can't move, they can't do anything. So we then look to, okay, what is the medical procedure? How do they medevac people out? What do they do with individuals that are really limited? Do they have a hierarchy of who goes first? Stuff like that. Because remember, different hospitals have a different hierarchy. I call it the Titanic situation, a different hierarchy of who's going to go first, who's going to go next. And sometimes it's based off of, elevators versus stairs. Sometimes it's based off of floors, where things are located, how buildings are attached to each other, how, who can get out this door and make it 300 feet over there to the helicopter pad. Sometimes it's based off of that stuff too. So the thing I look at is, yeah, okay, fine. You could make that group the ones who would have the most difficulty surviving in a warlike scenario. But then at the same time, I sit there and I go to myself, you know what? I don't know. Because wars, the beginning of it is we're marching healthy soldiers into this situation. And then the middle and end of it is we're taking unhealthy soldiers and we're trying to treat them and save their lives and get them back together, right? We're trying to take these veterans now and fix them and things like that. So to me, the government should be realistically very set up to actually take care of and assist these individuals that are in hospitals, because half of war is taking care of, in the long-term sense, those individuals who have been injured, who have been mentally disturbed, etc., from something they were, a part of. So I guess from my perspective, I just look at this situation and I say, I don't know. I don't know if those people who are like in the hospital are really in the worst situation, because to be fair, they're already in a location that usually has backup power. They're already in a location that already has medical staff. And if they have to be moved, the medical facility, the hospital, has an entire procedure set up for them. So that brings me back to the people who have the mental impairments, the people who sit in a room and play video games all day, sit in a room and lay in a bed because they're super stressed and they can't move about. Now, some of you will say, what about the musculoskeletal, spinal injury, quadriplegic individuals? They live at home. Usually they don't live alone, but sometimes they do. What about them? What happens to them? I feel like, to be fair, that group of individuals has a transportation method set up. They've recently used it. It's part of their routine, usually more often than not, right? Because they have specialty vans, they have specialty transport vehicles. And then my brain goes back to these people that have these mental impairments who specifically throw themselves into a room and never come out. They are the official living in a bubble. And so I guess from my perspective, I go back to these people that have mental impairments. You go back to this whole idea of, what do they understand as an appropriate action? Can they concentrate and come up with a good idea of how to escape this war-torn geographic area? Are they able to do things independent of others, or are they always reliant on somebody making food for them, doing their laundry for them, plugging things in for them, charging their phone for them? And I get to the, some of you guys, and it doesn't have to necessarily be something that's like a really difficult, severe version of autism, or, it could be Down syndrome, or it could be MS, or it doesn't have to be that, you know what I mean? Where the body is sending electrical signals in a weird way, it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It could be a lesser form of that. You could just get somebody who is, and I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, the person who really can't figure it out, would be somebody with a super low IQ, or wouldn't have analysis skills. But even if you just went a couple, severity levels up to more like, severe to moderate to mild, and you start to look at individuals and think to yourself, man, what about the person that's sitting there with anxiety and they're afraid to leave their room? They have a fear of interacting with others. And they're hearing all these things happening outside of them. And, they could live in the city, they could live in the suburb, whatever. It doesn't matter. But the point is, they're hearing all this stuff going on. And I don't think most Americans realize the effect that that has on an unhealthy brain. Just let me give you an example. Let's go back to like colonial times, right? Or let's go back to the first war of America. Let's make it relevant to America here. So you got these red coats, you got the blue coats, the grayish, tannish coats, you got all that stuff, right? And so imagine you're sitting in a house, right? And you are hearing them line up, and you're hearing the cannons outside, and you're wondering what's going to happen to you. Okay. Now remember, that's very old technology. We're taking a big metal pipe and a big metal ball, and we're shooting it that way, right? That is old technology. Imagine what would happen to you if there were, for example, outside of your house, your room, your bedroom, whatever, you were hearing new types of sounds. Okay. You were hearing, high frequency war sounds. You were hearing laser like sounds. You were hearing, extreme high velocity projectile sounds. You were hearing classic sounds like weaponry sounds. You were hearing drop sounds. You were hearing parachute sounds. To me, to be fair, in that situation, I don't think a lot of people realize what effect that would have on somebody's brain. Because immediately that person's brain, whether, let's say it's a healthy brain, they're happy, they're able to figure things out, they have analysis skills. They immediately know, they immediately know that they are not prepared for the situation. They immediately know that they are in a losing position, because if the enemy is outside, they're winning, right? Even if it's your side's outside and you're hearing a whole lot of bang bang and pew pew and stuff like that, you know that there's a potential that you are in a bad situation. And I just don't think people realize how that would affect even a healthy brain. I mean, you would go into extreme anxiety mode. And I want to just cue your brain up to the reality of this, because I don't think a lot of you have a good understanding as to like what it would actually be like, what it would actually feel like. And so just to give you an understanding, let's say that you're in a building. Okay. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. Let's say there's 10 floors to the building. You're on floor like 8. You're on floor 8. And you hear, right, something come over the intercom, something, there's a helicopter outside that's saying, active, person, could be a this, could be a that, but they're a criminal, that could be somebody shooting something, whatever. And they're on floor 5. They're on floor 5. And you can hear the damage getting closer and closer as that person climbs the stairs and goes up and down the halls, causing damage. It's that same inevitable feeling that you are in a really tough situation. Now, some of you, have a full understanding of how to protect yourself, right? Which is amazing. You have your licenses, concealed carries, all that stuff. You have that stuff. So some of you are like waiting for that moment to happen because you have the exact solution that you've prepared for. But a lot of disabled people, they don't have that. You know what I mean? A lot of disabled people live in the world where they just kind of watch the TV, and TV tells them, gun bad. You know what I mean? And then it's bad because it could cause harm to somebody. That is the point of it. That is the point of it. Like I was watching. So he was, because I watch Fox News and CNN, and I watch both sides as an independent person. And then in the comments, I saw people talking about like, the assassination attempts of Trump and things like that. They're like, it must have been planned. It must have been this. It must have been that. And each comment that I read, it was clear that that person who posted it had never owned a firearm, had never used a firearm. They would just live in a different reality because they've been fed something from news, from politicians, to go in a particular direction with their brain. It was like watching people who just had like, a misunderstanding of what it was, how it worked, what it does, distance relations, aiming capacity, right? Just the basics of it. They didn't understand the basics of it. And so what was interesting is, as I was reading through these comments, wading through what people were saying, to me, it was like, experiencing, just this situation where people were in panic and they were willing to accept anything because gun equals bad. And I was just like amazed by this. I was amazed by the propensity of people to just accept what other people were shooting their way and saying, this is what it must have been. This is how it could have been. It must have been a lie. It must have been this, must have been that. And I guess what I've realized, with this whole situation, just to be fair, is that the American people don't have a firm understanding on how a lot of things work. And I think that that's one of the things that in a warlike scenario would hurt the disabled the most. Hear me out on this. I know some of you are going to be like, no. Hear me out on this, okay? Let's say we go to a place like India. And in India, you have people who know how to manufacture, how to, find the raw, elements, find the raw products, the textiles, whatever. They know how to find the raw stuff, make it into a product, package it, and ship it, and use that product, right? They know how to do the whole schmutz. They got A to B, they got the whole thing. A to Z, they got the whole thing, right? And that's because in their country and their culture, you got to learn how to do a lot of jobs so that you're always needed somewhere to make money somewhere to survive somewhere. That makes sense, right? But from my perspective, the reality is that Americans usually have one or two skills that are actually capable of having a vocation applied, in like a more specific setting. So like, let's say that they have good sales skills. They have vocations for that. Let's say they have good, eye-hand coordination skills, right? Could be sewing, could be, basically machine shop, whatever. It doesn't matter. But the point is, most Americans don't know how to make stuff. They'll know like a little bit of this part, a little bit of that part. I had this one position where I worked here and all I did there was this. I was machinist 3. And so I think one of the biggest things that's going to hurt the disabled in a warlike situation in the United States is that both the disabled and a lot of Americans, obviously the veterans tend to get a lot more of a mushroom of knowledge base. They learn all this and this and this and this and this. But a lot of Americans are going to be very desperate in a warlike scenario. So to me, if America went through a war, some of the combatants that the disabled would face would be other Americans, because in the desperation of other Americans to have stuff, right? Because they're going to need stuff, right? They're going to need to eat. They're going to need toiletries. They're going to need all kinds of stuff, right? Toothbrush, this or that. They're going to find disabled people and target them because they're going to be the easiest people to steal from. And I think this is true of the enemies. I think this is true of the Americans, because the Americans, they don't know how to go ahead and make things from things. So, like if I said to you guys, okay, how many of you know how to sew? How many of you know how to weld? How many of you know how to replace a tire? How many of you know how to paint a house? How many of you know how to, cook over an open fire? How many of you know how to prepare a fish? And what we realize is that a lot of Americans just don't know how to do stuff anymore. And a lot of that is because you're not from a farm background. So like if I said to you, go till the ground, you'd be like, how does that work? How am I going to do that? I'm going to do that. Princess Diana 62, thank you for the $2 donation. Excellent. Howdy. No worries. So the big thing is, keeping in mind with this, I guess from my perspective in this whole situation, is that I think the people who are mentally unsound are going to be not surrounded by medical personnel in their most needed moments. They're going to be in their house. And I feel like, to be fair, other Americans are going to steal from them because other Americans just don't know how to make stuff. They don't know how to do stuff. If you gave a Campbell's soup to somebody and it was old and you had to see what you could do to revive it, and Google wasn't available, right? You couldn't Google it on your phone because we're in war. Then what would you do? If you had creek water and you needed a sip, how would you go ahead and cleanse the water to be able to drink it? And so I think that realistically, the people who would do the most poorly in that situation would be the mentally unsound, low IQ, genetic defect at birth, where basically they couldn't think through things, they didn't have analysis skills. Although, if they're really, really bad, there's usually some sort of system already in place to grab them, to get them, to transport them. And then you got the people who are like in that middle ground. They have anxiety or depression. They're not impatient a lot, They're just kind of like, they're in their moment, they're in their space, they're in their bubble. Those people I feel like would have the worst time, the worst scenario, the worst situation. And let me give you a reason why. If there is a scenario where a war occurs and it reaches America, it's plausible. Many of you think it won't, but that just shows you how American you are. But let's say that, for example, a war does actually reach us. Comes, it's here, it's happening. Let's say it's one county over from where you're at, right? Some of you would find a way to get as far away from it as possible. Some of you would be frozen to that spot because you don't leave, you don't go anywhere, you don't do anything. You talk to your doctor through a phone, and it's a therapist that's just sometimes, giving you some good details, sometimes just pleasing your in that moment ego. I know a lot of people with mental impairments that go through that. And so I guess the point I'm getting at with this whole structural situation is, if we really sit back and think about it, those Americans that are basically existing someplace and don't have a way or a means to protect themselves, including their thought patterns, they're the first ones that are going to get robbed. They're the first ones that are going to be taken from, because people are going to know, right, that individual likely is a soft target. And as a result of that, I think one of the really difficult things is that something that's holding those people back from protecting themselves, a lot of those individuals won't get into, learning about, self-defense, protection. It could be for whatever reason. It could be the politics of the land. Like, you grew up in Washington, you know what I mean, on the West Coast, or New York, right? Or, Maine or whatever. Well, Maine's going super, super left. It may become a quasi, no self-defense kind of, we'll see what happens. But I guess the point that I'm getting at is, people with mental impairments, it could be a political thing where they've been taught throughout their life not to find a way to protect themselves. Or it could be a mental thing where they're just afraid to defend themselves in a situation because they feel like no matter what happens, the retribution coming back towards them will be far greater. And I think that, at the end of the day, I think, and I know this is an idea that a lot of you are going to disagree with, but I think at the end of the day, we need to have in school, including our special education classes, basically public safety. I really think we need to have that. There was a time where people would, train with this stuff. There was a time where Americans could be, relied upon to create an army out of nowhere, even if they had nothing to do with the military. There was a time for that. And I'm not saying we have to go back to that level, although technically all men under 46 are in that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm on a selective service role. If any of you guys are under 46, I think it is, you're on a select service role. Like, your name is on a government website, a .gov website, saying if something happens, they're going to call on you. Lynn Wilson, thank you for the $20 donation. That's absolutely amazing. Let me put a little heart there. Hi, I love watching your videos. You care so much about the underdog, and that makes my heart smile. Thank you for all you do, sir. I really do. I really do care about the underdog, because I think we can learn the most usually from the underdogs. So what is an underdog? It's somebody who potentially could become a great achiever. It's also recognizing somebody has an inherent like flaw, weakness in the chain, or there's some sort of limitation, right? When they make movies, they're always like, okay, what's the superhuman character's flaw? What's their kryptonite? What makes them weak? And inherent with that, the studying of an individual as to how they could become David and Goliath situation where David wins, how they could, win the day is the best way that we can study how to effectively, make people's lives better. I mean, think about it for a moment. Let's say that you wanted to invent something. You invent the microwave, the dishwasher, the clothing washer, the clothing dryer, the this, the that, whatever. These are all things that were created because we wanted to make life easier for everybody, but especially those who had a tough time. Think about all the orthotics out there. Think about all the 3D printers that are working away to make medical devices for people that normally would have a much more difficult time in their life without that stuff. We're innovating for the underdog. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. When the person asked me this question, who in a nuclear war would be the most horribly touched by the negatives of war, harshly treated by the negatives of war, I had some ideas, but I changed my mind as to where I'm at on this thing. Here's why I think this is important. I think it's important because when we look at the structural capacity of society, we understand that society is filled with people who have needs and they are going to take. And so the moment we have a war scenario and people are trying to get into a safety mode, I don't know if you know this, but some people, they'll go into a bunker, right? And they'll close off the doors, and whatever they have in the bunker, that is what it is. Whatever people steal from the house, it is what it is, right? Okay. A lot of people don't have bunkers. I don't have a bunker. You probably don't have a bunker. Some of you have bunkers, but the bunker isn't filled with recent food, or it's not up to date, or it doesn't have all the tech you need, or whatever, so on and so forth. I think the thing that is interesting about America is that you'll see advertisements for buying survival food, survival bags, survival this, survival that. But Americans largely live without war. I mean, sure, we just took out a nuclear, site, but we largely as citizens, we don't really interact with it. When we had our past Middle East wars, you and I didn't really interact with that. You know what I mean? We didn't interact with that. We saw pictures, saw tents, we saw some stuff on YouTube where they were posting videos of stuff that they accomplished or did or whatever, but we really didn't interact with it. And that's, I think, what is missing from this cognitive exercise is the understanding of seeing it through YouTube, and then they're actually 3 buildings down and you can hear the people screaming. And that's how scary that is. And that's why when I thought about this video, I thought about all these different groups, and the first thing, so the first group that really came to mind, just boop, immediately, were blind people. I was like, blind people, of course, are going to have the hardest time in war. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. Blind people, they got a lot of ways of getting around. They're used to getting around. Yeah, sure, it's not the same. Sure, there's going to be obstructions. Yeah. Okay. Then I went to, what about hearing impaired? What about spinal deficiencies, right? They can't walk properly. They're going to be in wheelchairs, stuff like that. And that's when I landed on people with mental impairments, because they're not going to know what to do, or they're going to make the wrong choice, or they're going to go ahead and not understand the consequence of a choice and then do something that's going to put themselves in danger. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting, is that when you look at, for example, Social Security benefits, okay, not VA compensation, but like Social Security benefits. When was the last time the SSA reached out to you about what you could do as a disabled person in case of a war scenario? Some of you would be like, well, that's not the purpose of the Social Security Administration. That's like the purpose of the DOD, or, whatever, the military, whatever. But again, who administers information, money, and health insurance if not the Social Security Administration? Because it's them. It's the SSA. They do the SSI. They do the SSDI benefits. And I think what's interesting about that is people in America live without the fear of something bad happening down the street. Yeah, sure, somebody might get cancer. Somebody might get cancer down the, granted, it's whatever. You know how it is. Could be somebody down the road. But I guess what my whole point to this whole situation is that, at the end of the day, we live, devoid of the fear of that classic pedal tone of anxiety as to when it's potentially going to end, what potentially is going to happen, etc. And I think that that's a really interesting situation. And I think we need to analyze that a little bit better, figure out what it is about us that makes us feel like we are so in such a superior spot on the spectrum of countries when it comes to no potential harm coming to us. We have great intelligence, we have spies, right? We have incredible machinery, drones, helicopters, jets, tanks, personnel, highly trained, all that stuff. Got all of it. But have any of you guys ever thought about how big our coastlines are? How big our borders are with Mexico and Canada? Do you ever think about, like, for a moment there, how much space there is for something to happen, an incursion to occur? It's massive. It's absolutely massive. If you took all of our military gear and lined it up, you wouldn't fill up one side of it. You wouldn't. You wouldn't. So I guess from my perspective with this, my point with this is that at the end of the day, we should take a better look at essentially what's potentially coming. Because in my belief, yeah, Trump has pulled off something unbelievable. In a little bit more than a week, a war ends between two nations that are literally in it to win it for a holy war. I don't think that's what's going to happen. What I think is going to happen is they're taking a break, and then all of the parent nations that are feeding the active nations in the war are figuring out what next steps they're going to be taking to go ahead and do whatever they want. I could be wrong. It could be peace for the rest of the time. It could be peace for the rest of the time. But when you have the human race, the great distance of our timeline is lots of war. It's just war and war over again, over and over again. We fight for land, we fight for this, we fight for that. It's just war over and over again. So point is, if you are somebody who potentially has mental impairments, I would start working on with somebody who doesn't have mental impairments, a list of objectives and things to start doing to prepare yourself, like a ditch bag, stuff that goes in a bag that you use to leave, to ditch the location you're at to go somewhere else, or having places lined up or a map or something that shows you where to go when something happens. Because to be fair, America it feels like an untouchable nation, but the moment China gets involved, if India doesn't go our way, things get bad real fast. They get bad really, really fast. All right. With that said, please remember to like and subscribe. Real quick shout out to Princess Diana. She did a $10 donation and another $2 donation during the live stream, which is absolutely, absolutely amazing. So if you see Diana, she's like royalty to this channel. So make sure you give her a good thumbs up and a good howdy. Very important. I will catch you all at the next video where I go live to answer questions for free. It is super late, but bottom line is we should be able to get a couple of answers going on for people. Again, Attorney Walter Hnot. Remember to like, subscribe, head over to Google, type in Disability Resolution Law Firm or Disability Resolution Florida. Throw some stars up there if you like. And please remember, on Mondays and Thursdays, I go live to answer questions for free. Usually it's not this late, but it is usually later. And then also, if you need a full 1-hour consultation, mini contract is below. And then, of course, if you want to hire me to work on winning disability benefits for you, you know how to reach out. Just call the law firm number. I'll catch you at the next video. We'll rock and roll from there. Attorney Walter Hnot, thank you so much. And I'll see you in about 10 minutes. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.